Welcome, fearless listeners, to Phantom Fables, your destination for haunting tales and eerie mysteries. Tonight, we unravel the sinister secrets hidden within an old abandoned mill where the very air is woven with dread and despair. Beware, this is not a tale, but a plunge into horror. The threads of fear said to bind this mill are believed to be under some sort of curse, and anyone who ventures into its shadows has to face the darkness that lies within. This is the haunting story of Threads of Fear. It was 1687, and the air in Wallachia was heavy with legends. The nights in this small, remote village of Zovrin were darker than elsewhere, as if the sky itself was too afraid to shine its stars upon the cursed land. Shadows danced on the cobblestone streets as the villagers whispered tales of the Snavista castle, perched high on the cliffs overlooking the village. The castle stood abandoned for almost 2 centuries, but still its dark outline hung like a vulture over the forlorn town. Almost everybody in Zovrin spoke infrequently about this castle, however very cautiously. The hushed tales shared by them described something of a magical carpet made by threads of men's lives while weaving the corridors of this magical tower. They referred that the carpet of this beauty possessed some sort of vessel carrying great curses, not only tying individuals' lives up into these marvelous creations, but also tied the fate they would eventually succumb to. It was into this chilling setting that Jehoshaphat, a young scholar from Prague, arrived. He was accompanied by his loyal companion, Jehoahaz, a skeptic with a sharp wit, and Hanok, a reserved yet courageous researcher of arcane arts. Their journey to Zovrin had not been easy. The winding mountain paths seemed to lead them deeper into an abyss of despair with every step. Jehoshaphat carried with him an ancient tome called the Codex of Shadows, of which only tatters were believed to exist anywhere in the land. The Codex contained hints of the Thread of Destiny, a magical artifact that Jehoshaphat believed was just the accursed carpet of Snavista Castle. The trio entered Zovrin on a cold autumn evening. The village seemed frozen in time, its buildings worn and weathered, their wooden beams sagging under the weight of years. Villagers eyed the newcomers with suspicion, their faces pale and drawn, as though they had seen specters haunting their days. The village inn was where an old man by the name of Kalo, the innkeeper, greeted them. "You have come to the wrong place if you seek peace," he grumbled, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Jehoshaphat smiled politely. "We seek knowledge, not peace," he replied. "What can you tell us about the castle?" Kalo froze, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the counter. "The castle is a graveyard for the living," he whispered. "Many have entered, none have returned. The carpet you seek, it doesn't just take your soul, it weaves it into its cursed threads." Despite the cautioning, Jehoshaphat and his companions were still unabated. At night, they pored over maps and notes, plotting how to travel into the castle. Unbeknownst to them, their presence would stir an age-old evil which had slumbered there for centuries, ready to awaken at will. Adina, a local herbalist and healer, joined them the next morning. Her sharp green eyes hinted at a wisdom far beyond her years. She had been the only one willing to guide them to the castle. As they went through the dense, mist-laden forest leading to Snavista Castle, Adina related the legend of the carpet. 2 centuries ago, she started, her voice steady. The castle belonged to a nobleman named Dmitry Valenko, man obsessed with power. He wanted to create a tapestry that would bind the fates of his enemies and make him invincible. For this, he turned to dark arts, murdering quite a number of people and soaking their soul's essence into the threads of this tapestry. But the magic backfired, she continued. The carpet became a sentient entity, feeding on fear and life. Dmitri disappeared, and the castle fell into ruin. Yet the carpet remains, waiting for those foolish enough to disturb it. Jehoshaphat had very attentive ears, his mind racing with the various possibilities that could play out. If such a thing did exist, it would be what would unlock the mysteries regarding fate and its destiny, a discovery most unexampled in history. By the time they reached the castle, dusk had fallen. The imposing gates were rusted and broken, hanging limply on their hinges. The air was filled with an unnatural chill, and even the forest seemed to hold its breath as they approached. Inside, the castle remained a jumble of tattered corridors and grand halls, their former splendor dropped into dust and decay. A smell of mildew clung to the walls, but something far fouler still lingered in the air. Adina took them to the great hall, where the carpet was kept. The room was cavernous, its high ceilings lost in darkness. At its center lay the carpet, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Its intricate patterns seemed to ripple and shift as if alive, and the colors, the reds as deep as blood, the gold that seemed to mirror the setting sun, seemed impossible in the dim light. Hannock stepped forward with fingers trembling out of a sense of both awe and trepidation. "It's so beautiful," he whispered. However, just as his hand went ahead to reach it, Adina gripped his arm to stop him. "Don't! The carpet eats more souls." As they stood there, transfixed, a low hum filled the air. The patterns on the carpet began to glow faintly, and a whisper, barely audible, seemed to come from its threads. It was not one voice, but many, a cacophony of mournful pleads and tormented cries. Jehoshaphat clutched the Codex of Shadows, flipping frantically through its pages. "The ritual," he muttered. "There is a ritual to control it." But before he could finish, the castle itself seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and a bitter wind swept through the hall, extinguishing their lanterns. Shadows twisted and stretched, forming shapes that danced across the walls. Jehoahaz lit a torch, his face pale but resolute. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "No," Jehoshaphat replied, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his heart. "We've come too far. This is our chance to uncover the truth." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a ghostly apparition with hollow eyes and a voice like shattered glass. It reached out toward them, its translucent fingers trailing threads of light. Adina screamed, her voice piercing the heavy silence. The apparition stopped, its head tilting as if in recognition. "The threads bind us all," it rasped. "You cannot escape." The group retreated to a side chamber, barricading the door behind them. Adina was shaking, her usually calm demeanor shattered. "That was one of them," she said, her voice trembling. "One of the souls trapped in the carpet." Jehoshaphat nodded grimly. "We must first know what it is before we can kill it," he said. "This isn't just a curse, it's a jail for the souls of the doomed." As they prepared to go further into the castle, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the halls. The ends of the carpet seemed to stretch and twist into corded tendrils, as if the castle itself was alive and watching. Unbeknownst to them, they had already set into motion events that could not be undone. The carpet had been waiting, and now it had new threads to weave. The oppressive silence of the castle weighed on the group as they sat huddled in the side chamber. The whispers from the great hall had not ceased, growing more insistent, like 1,000 voices crying out in despair. Jehoshaphat, the de facto leader of the group, ran his fingers over the cracked spine of the Codex of Shadows, his mind racing to decipher its cryptic text. The room that they had ducked into looked like an ancient library. Bookshelves bore dusty tomes on them, covered with a patina of dust, making it impossible to guess the titles because the spines were not discernible. At the far end, a ragged tapestry hung on a wall, featuring a scene depicting what seemed an ancient ritual. Hoods around some fire, which blazed brightly. Hands reached out toward something glowing suspended mid-air. "This isn't just a castle," Hannock whispered, breaking the silence. "It's a temple to something far older, far darker." Adina stood against the wall, still shaken by the apparition they had encountered, her green eyes darting nervously toward the door. "You should have listened," she said bitterly. "I warned you about the carpet. This place doesn't just hold a curse, it breathes it." Jehoshaphat looked up, his face grave. "And yet here we are," he said. "This curse is not an accident of fate. It was created by men who sought to bend destiny to their will. If we can understand how it was made, we can destroy it. Or it will destroy us first," muttered Jehoahaz, his skepticism now tinged with genuine fear. And then the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was almost more disturbing than the noise. Kalo, the old innkeeper who had reluctantly joined them, shivered and crossed himself. "It's never quiet for long," he whispered. And he was right. Just a little while later, the air is filled with low, resonant humming. The tapestry in the wall swayed, as though something had reached in and shaken it, and threads began to shine faintly across its weave. Jehoshaphat rises, his voice firm, although he is far from firm inside. "We have to get out of here. We will become this place if we remain." With torches in hand, the party ventured deeper into the castle. The narrow corridors twisted and turned, like the intestines of some great beast. Their stone walls were damp and cold to the touch. The air grew heavier with each step, laden with the scent of decay and something metallic. Blood, perhaps. They came upon a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The Codex of Shadows had mentioned a hidden chamber beneath the castle where Dmitry Valenko had performed his dark rituals, giving birth to the accursed carpet. "Do we really have to go down there?" Chaya asked, her voice quivering. Jehoshaphat nodded. "If we want answers, we have no choice." The descent was slow and nerve-wracking. The further they went, the colder it became. Their breath misted in the air, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the castle itself was amplifying the sound. They finally arrived at the bottom. The room they entered was huge, with walls covered in symbols carved into what seemed to be dried blood. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on top of it was a tiny piece of the accursed carpet. As Jehoshaphat approached the altar, the fragment started glowing. A wave of nausea washed over him, and his vision blurred. He was no longer in the chamber. Instead, he found himself standing in a grand hall filled with people dressed in opulent clothing from centuries past. At the center of the hall, Dmitry Valenko stood beside the carpet, chanting in a guttural language that made Jehoshaphat's skin crawl. The scene shifted abruptly. The guests were no longer living beings but monstrous caricatures of their former selves, bloated and decayed, their mouths stretched open in silent screams. The carpet writhed under them like a living thing, its threads pulsing with an unnatural light. Jehoshaphat staggered back, the vision fading. The others rushed to his side, filled with concern for their fellow guest. "What happened?" asked Adina. Jehoshaphat caught his breath. "I saw him, Valenko. He bound the souls of everyone in that hall to the carpet. They're still trapped in it." The room didn't even have time to absorb what Jehoshaphat said before the air in the chamber chilled. A faint mist coalesced into a man, a spirit. His face was hollow, and his eyes were voids of endless darkness. "You must not be here," the ghost declared, its tone a low grumble that came from the floor itself. Carefully, Jehoshaphat advanced. "What are you?" he asked. "I was once the servant of Valenko," he said. "I tried to stop him and it swallowed me in. Leave it once, else it will swallow you too." "It can be torn apart," Jehoshaphat said. Hollow, cruel laughter by the spirit. "You can't destroy that which is part of the pattern woven into the fabric of destiny itself. The carpet feeds upon fear, upon despair. The harder you fight, the stronger it gets." As the spirit faded, the chamber plunged into chaos. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the symbols etched into the stone began to glow ominously. The fragment of the carpet on the altar twisted and expanded, its threads reaching out like tendrils. One of the tendrils snatched Chaya's arm, dragging her to the altar. She screamed as the threads began to burrow into her skin, her eyes wide with terror. Hanok and Jehoahaz rushed to her side, burning the threads with their torches. The carpet recoiled, screeching in a high-pitched whine that echoed through the chamber. "We have to get out of here," Adina yelled. Jehoshaphat snatched the piece off the altar, paying no mind to the searing agony as it scorched his hand. "Not without this," he said between clenched teeth. The group fled the chamber, the walls writhing and pulsing like the castle itself was trying to trap them. They stumbled up onto the upper floors of the castle, gasping for breath. Chaya's arm was badly burned and Kalo muttered prayers under his breath. Jehoshaphat unwound the wrappings from his hand so he could study the fragment. It had stopped shining, but an evil quality emanated from it. "This is the key," he said. "If we can untangle the threads of this fragment, we may be able to shatter the curse." "But how?" Hanok asked. Jehoshaphat raised the Codex of Shadows. "The answers are here. We simply need time to decode them." As they retreated into another chamber to get their bearings, the whispers receded, and yet grew louder, more strident than before. The castle itself seemed alive and was angry. Adina gazed up at Jehoshaphat, her face set into a serious line. "Whatever we're fighting, it isn't going to let us out easily." Jehoshaphat nodded. "Then we have to fight it. The strands of fear can bind us, but won't have us controlled by it." Little did they know the castle had yet to unleash all its horrors. The air in the room had thickened, heavy and oppressive, a chore to breathe at times. Whispers now had become loud whispers that seemed to creep through ancient stone cracks within the walls, as if words only half heard still penetrated souls very deep. Jehoshaphat stared at the piece of the accursed carpet in his hand. The malevolent energy that radiated from it was alive, a throbbing evil that seemed to be attuned to the castle's every groan and creak. The others sat in tight-lipped silence around him, their faces pale and their eyes telling of the growing fear gnawing at their resolve. "We cannot stay here," Chaya whispered, her voice trembling. Her injured arm was swathed in a makeshift bandage, but the dark tendrils of the burn seemed to crawl further up her skin. "It's watching us. It knows we're here." The group agreed to move, though their steps were slow and uncertain. They entered a grand hall, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. Broken chandeliers hung precariously, their crystals casting faint, distorted reflections in the flickering torchlight. At the far end of the hall, a massive loom stood, draped in thick cobwebs. The loom cast a shiver down Jehoshaphat's spine. In its wooden framework, symbols were inscribed that reminded him of those in the Codex of Shadows. The threads reaching across it shimmered faintly with a life, as if they knew something was there, colors shuffling in incomprehensible fashions. Kalo had barely spoken up above a whisper. "This is where it was started. Cursed carpet began here." Adina approached slowly, her hand touching the hilt of a dagger small enough for her to grasp. "Do you think there is any of it left on that loom?" she asked. He shook his head. "Number. But perhaps the purpose it held can be made known to it. Then if we know how to break its connection, then perhaps we have a way through." As Jehoshaphat looked at the loom, the whispers came louder, merging into one mournful wail. The room seemed to darken even further, with a cold draft that snuffed out their torches. "Stay together!" Jehoshaphat yelled in a voice now barely audible above the rising tumult. The darkness in the room began to wriggle together, forming formless shapes, figures caught in limbo. They moved awkwardly, almost jerky. Their hollowed eyes were centered on the people. One of the figures moved forward, taking on a definite shape. Tall, skeletal man in tattered robes. His voice was like stone grinding as he spoke. you seek to undo what cannot be undone. The threads of fate are woven too tightly. Jehoshaphat held up the fragment of the carpet, and the energy inside it flared as if in response to the apparition. "Who are you?" he demanded. The hollow gaze of the figure shifted to the fragment. "I am a weaver, doomed to this loom for eternity. My hands wove the threads that bind this castle, that bind you. Leave now, or become part of the tapestry." Before anyone could say a word, the room exploded into chaos. The shadows rushed forward, their forms taking on grotesque, monster-like features, half human, half thread. Their movements were erratic but swift, claw-like hands reaching for the group. "Run!" Adina shrieked, slashing at one of the creatures with her dagger. The group scattered, dodging and weaving through the monstrous onslaught. Jehoshaphat clutched the fragment tightly, its heat searing his palm but somehow repelling the creatures that came too close. They ran into a narrow corridor, the walls closing in on them. The air was stifling, heavy with the smell of rot. Behind them, the creatures howled, their footsteps echoing ominously. "This way!" Hannock shouted, leading them through a hidden door concealed behind a rotting tapestry. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the corridor. The secret passage led them to a small chamber, whose walls were covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen throughout the castle. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested a small, ornate box. Jehoshaphat approached the box cautiously. "This might be what we need," he said, his voice hushed. Adina frowned. "Are you sure it's not another trap?" "We don't have a choice," Jehoshaphat replied, opening the box. Inside was a small spool of thread, its color a deep, unnatural red that seemed to absorb the light around it. The energy radiating from it was even stronger than that of the fragment. "The heart of the curse," Jehoshaphat murmured. "This thread is what binds the carpet and the castle." As Jehoshaphat gazed at the spool, another vision consumed him. He was no longer in the chamber, but in the castle's great hall when it was at its peak. Dmitry Valenko stood before the loom, making the cursed carpet with the red thread. Behind him, nobles couldn't take their eyes from the great magic taking place. The scene changed, and Jehoshaphat saw the aftermath. The same nobles, their bodies twisted and broken, their souls bound to the carpet. Valenko stood triumphant, his face alight with madness. Jehoshaphat staggered back, the vision fading. "This thread is the key," he said. "If we destroy it, we can unravel the curse." "But how do we destroy something so powerful?" Chaya asked, her voice trembling. Jehoshaphat scanned the Codex of Shadows. "The answer has to be in here. We just need time to find it." As they were leaving the chamber, the walls began to tremble. The symbols etched into the stone began glowing brightly, and the deafening roar filled the air. "The castle knows what we've taken," Kalo shouted. Once again the group fled, holding the thread and the fragment clasped within Jehoshaphat's grasping hands. The corridors curled and unraveled, the castle itself shifted to thwart them. Finally they came out into an open courtyard, a swirly sky above their heads, twisted black clouds pulsing with an energy equal to that of the thread. Jehoshaphat turned to them. "We have what we need, but the castle won't give us up that easily. Hang close, whatever happens, never let go of your courage. Fear is the fuel for this curse." They nodded, settling into their determined stance despite fear's grip upon them. The night had gone colder, sharper with an unnatural chill that had seemed to reach into the soul, and as they stood in the courtyard of the castle with Jehoshaphat, some sense of doomed foreboding settled over the group like a suffocating shroud. Cursed thread was pulsing very faintly through his hands. Each throb resonated like dark energy itself, animating an entire structure round them. Above them, the sky churned violently, the moon occasionally breaking through the roiling clouds to cast an eerie, silver glow on the stone courtyard. The castle's looming towers seemed to bend inward, as if watching them, judging their every move. "We need to move," Adina urged, her eyes darting nervously toward the shifting shadows that danced along the edges of the courtyard. "Staying here will only make it easier for this place to trap us." Jehoshaphat nodded, holding the thread tighter. "We have the key to breaking the curse, but the castle won't make it easy for us to find the way out. We need to focus on finding the altar Dmitry Valenko used. It's where the curse was bound, and it's where it must be undone." The group re-entered the castle, its labyrinthine halls even more oppressive than before. The torches flickered with an unsteady light, throwing monstrous shapes that seemed to writhe and twist on the walls. Every step echoed too loudly, the sound bouncing back in distorted fragments that made it impossible to tell where they came from. "This place is alive," Chaya whispered, her voice trembling. Her injured arm was now blackened to the elbow, the curse spreading with a malign intent. "It's not alive," Hanuk corrected, though his voice was equally strained. "It's worse. It's aware." Jehoshaphat led them with caution, seeking out the pages of the Codex of Shadows as they progressed. Its pages seemed to shift upon their own power, revealing the diagrams and incantations of the castle's deeper nature. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a drawing of the altar surrounded by ancient symbols. "The altar is in the castle's heart, a place designed to twist and distort anyone who approaches it. We'll need to stay together and keep our wits about us." As they walked deeper, the air became thick with a heavy weight, and it carried with it the faint sound of weeping. It was distant at first, but as they pressed on, it grew louder, more desperate, until it filled the air like a lamentation for the damned. They stepped into a great staircase curving down into darkness. Down at the bottom of the stairs, indistinct figures started to coalesce, ghostly apparitions of men, women, and children, their faces contorted in agony, their mouths opening and closing wordlessly as they reached out to the group. Chaya shrank back, grabbing Kalo's arm. "They're the ones tied to the curse, aren't they? The souls caught in the threads." Jehoshaphat nodded grimly. "They're trying to warn us, or perhaps they're trying to stop us. Either way, we can't let them deter us." As they climbed down, the figures grew more solid, their silent pleas transforming into whispers that clawed at the edges of the group's minds. "Turn back. You cannot save us. Join us in the tapestry." The voices grew louder with each step, and the shadows seemed to come alive, reaching out with clawed hands. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a massive chamber unlike any they had seen before. The walls were covered in intricate tapestries, each depicting scenes of horror and despair. Faces contorted in pain, bodies twisted unnaturally, and eyes filled with terror. At the center of the room stood the altar, black stone slab jaggedly rough in texture, covered in strange symbols that glowed dimly. Around it, the air shimmered with unnatural light, as if the fabric of reality itself was thinner here. Jehoshaphat came cautiously up, the spool of red thread in his hand, glowing more brightly as he drew near to the altar. "This is it," he said. "This is where Dmitry Valenko bound the curse." The others hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to turn back. But Jehoshaphat's determination carried them forward. When Jehoshaphat put the spool of thread upon the altar, the room shook so violently that walls seemed to close in and deafening roars filled the air. From the shadows emerged a figure of a size, its form a grotesque amalgamation of human and thread. Its face was hidden behind a veil of shifting strands, and its limbs moved with jerky, unnatural grace. The voice of the guardian was guttural and growling, each word dripping with malice. "You dare to unweave what has been bound? You will become part of the tapestry." The group scattered as the guardian lunged forward, its clawed hands slashing through the air. Kalo drew his sword, striking at the creature, but the blade passed through its form as though it were made of smoke. Jehoshaphat feverishly flipped through the Codex of Shadows, trying to find some way to counter the Guardian. "It's bound to the thread," he yelled. "We have to destroy the spool to weaken it." As the group strained against the Guardian, Jehoshaphat began to chant an incantation from the Codex. The symbols on the altar brightened, and the spool of thread began to unravel, its strands burning away like fire. The Guardian let out a bone-chilling scream, its form flickering as if trying to hold it together. But it fought back with renewed fury, its movements more erratic and violent. Chaya, despite her injuries, grabbed one of the burning strands and hurled it at the Guardian. The creature recoiled, its body convulsing as the thread burned through its form. "Keep it distracted," Jehoshaphat shouted as he continued the incantation. The others joined in, hurling burning strands at the Guardian and dodging its relentless attacks. The room shook violently, the tapestries on the walls bursting into flames as the curse began to unravel. As the last of the thread burned away, the Guardian let out one final ear-splitting roar before collapsing into a pile of ash. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting slightly. Jehoshaphat collapsed to his knees, the codex slipping from his hands. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "This was only the first step. The loom itself must be destroyed to break the curse completely." The others nodded, their exhaustion tempered by the faint glimmer of hope. Together they turned back toward the staircase, the flickering light of the burning tapestries guiding their way. But as they climbed, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The castle was not ready to let them go, and its wrath would only grow stronger. The castle loomed darker than ever, its spires towering high into the blackened sky. Outside, the wind howled and carried with it the screams of the cursed souls bound within the tapestry of shadows. They climbed the grand staircase once again, their footsteps heavy with the weight of confrontation. Each of them knew they were approaching the end, but none could be certain if they would survive the journey. Jehoshaphat hugged the Codex of Shadows close to his chest. That ancient book had guided them through the horrific nightmare that was the castle. Yet its final pages did not hold anything endearing. Instead, there were only nonsensical instructions about the loom of souls and its relation to the curse. "The loom isn't just an object," Jehoshaphat said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's alive, and it feeds on despair and fear. If we're to destroy it, we'll have to confront its will directly." Chaya, pale and trembling, managed a weak smile. "And what if its will is stronger than ours?" Jehoshaphat said nothing. Instead, he turned to the following page, and there appeared a map of the last room in the castle, the Sanctum of Threads, where the loom lay waiting. The sanctum door looked different from every door they'd come across before, made from the dark wood in which silver strings, pulsating feebly, resembled some dark veins running full of an odd kind of energy. There was an odor, like if the castle did its best not to let them go in. "This is it," Adina whispered, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. "This is where it all ends." Jehoshaphat placed his hand on the door, reciting an incantation from the codex. The silver threads glowed brighter, twisting and writhing before snapping apart with a deafening crack. The door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber bathed in an eerie, pulsating light. Amid the loom of souls stood its center in the hall. It seemed enormous, made of metal it was, covered with an unhealthy shine. Shining threads seemed of every color extending from the weaver's hands onto the loom. Every such thread seemed a luminous thread where the air trembled with sighs and woven hums sounded. As the group entered the room, the loom seemed to spring to life. Its threads writhed, twisting and weaving patterns in the air. The whispers grew louder, taking on words that echoed through the chamber. "Welcome, weavers of fate," the voice intoned, deep and resonant. "You have come to unbind what cannot be undone. You will fail, as all before you have." Jehoshaphat took a step forward, carrying in one hand the spool of red thread and in the other the codex. "We come here to shatter this curse and let go of those bound to this place. Your terror rule is ended tonight." The Weaver of Loom laughed out in cold hollowness. "Think you can defeat me? Am I not the Weaver of Destiny, Keeper of Despair? The very world unravels were one to release me from bond." The room started to shake as the loom's threads lashed out, each one a whip of searing energy. The group scattered, dodging the threads as they struck the ground, leaving scorched marks in their wake. Jehoshaphat flipped through the codex, searching for the final incantation. "I need time," he shouted. "Keep it distracted." Hanok and Kalo advanced, brandishing their swords. Despite knowing their blades would not cut the loom, their valor did not waver. They hacked at the threads, producing short diversions that enabled Jehoshaphat to concentrate on the incantation. Adina and Chaya took turns gathering the loose threads off the floor of the chamber and throwing them into the whirls of the loom. The machine moaned in revolt, its action becoming wilder. As Jehoshaphat reached the end of the incantation, the loom's attacks became more frantic. A thread lashed out, striking Chaya and sending her sprawling to the ground. Her scream echoed through the chamber as the thread began to pull her toward the loom. "No!" Adina cried, rushing to her side. She grabbed Chaya's arm, pulling with all her strength, but the loom's grip was too strong. Chaya looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "You have to let me go," she whispered. "It's the only way." Adina shook her head, refusing to let go. But Chaya reached up, placing a hand on her cheek. "You have to finish this. For all of us." With a final desperate scream, Adina let go, and Chaya was dragged into the loom. The machine shuddered violently, threads unraveling a little, as if weakened by her sacrifice. Jehoshaphat finished the incantation, his voice booming above the turmoil. The spool of red thread in his hand began to glow brightly, its light spreading through the room, consuming the threads of the loom. It howled deafeningly, then twisted and snapped upon the collapsing frame and the burning strands. The very walls of the chamber began their collapse as that which had spun went undone. "Run!" shouted Jehoshaphat, sweeping up Adina and Kalo. She and the latter tore toward the door, her son Hanok close upon her heels. They came out into the courtyard, just as the castle began to cave in on itself. The sky cleared, and a pale dawn broke over the horizon. The oppressive energy that had surrounded the castle was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Jehoshaphat fell to his knees, the codex slipping from his hands. "It's over," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The curse is broken." Adina and Kalo sat with him, pale but determined. Hanok stood there silently, his eyes on the ruin of the castle. With the first light of dawn breaking upon the ground, vague outlines begun to materialize. The souls attached to the loom appeared, their faces no longer distorted in pain. They looked up at the group with gratitude and disappeared into the light. Jehoshaphat closed his eyes and allowed a droplet to slide down his cheek. "They're free." But as they walked away, a faint whisper reached their ears, a remnant of the loom's voice. "Threads never truly break. They only change." The group exchanged uneasy glances before walking away, marked by the weight of the journey in their faces. Though the curse was broken, they knew the scars it had left would remain forever.